Martin Luther King Jr. may be one of the most inspiring and influential figures of the later half of the 20th century, but there is a flip side to Dr. King's legacy that distorts the narrative of the entire civil rights movement. After Rosa Parks famously refused to give up her seat to a white passenger, Dr. King emerged onto the scene as the leader of the 1955-1956 Montgomery bus boycott. When the campaign succeeded with the court's ruling that Alabama's bus segregation laws were unconstitutional, the media paid little attention to the larger movement and gave all the credit to Dr. King. Unfortunately, King's sudden celebrity status may have eroded his intuition and inhibited his ability to recognize potential talent. After the bus boycott, he became leader of the newly formed Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, founded in order to continue challenging segregation laws across the South. But he neglected to include women like Rosa Parks or local Montgomery organizers like E.D. Nixon in leadership positions within this new group. Referring to Dr. King in a letter to a friend, E.D. Nixon said he was frustrated when people give all recognition to one because of his academic training and forget others who do not have that kind of training but are making a worthwhile contribution. And Nixon had reason to be irritated. During MLK's early career in the 1950s, he was somewhat stingy and undemocratic when it came to sharing power. As a minister, he believed leadership never ascends from the pew to the pulpit, but invariably descends from the pulpit to the pew. But when looking at the entirety of the civil rights movement, it was, in fact, not an individual achievement from the top down, but a collective effort from the bottom up. As crucial as Dr. King was, the civil rights cause depended upon various leaders from the grassroots. Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech may be what's remembered from the March on Washington, but that historic protest would not have occurred if not for labor organizers like A. Philip Randolph, who had planned such a march for decades. King may also be credited for writing a justification for breaking unjust laws with the 1963 letter from Birmingham jail, but civil disobedience tactics were previously given credence with the Freedom Riders in 1961 led by James Farmer. The media paid particular attention to King because of his academic credentials and black middle-class background, but there wouldn't have been the historic Birmingham protests if not for what historian Andrew Manis calls the combative spirituality of working-class pastors like Fred Shuttlesworth. And there also wouldn't have been any of those figures either if not for the pre-civil rights era pioneers like Mary Church Terrell, Nannie Helen Burroughs, or Mary McLeod Bethune. And there are countless other inspiring figures who remind us that the civil rights movement depended upon various leaders, many of whom didn't get the proper credit then, and have unfortunately been largely forgotten by Americans today.
I'm on my way now, and I won't turn back. I'm on my way home, and I won't turn back. I'm on my way.
Long before Rosa Parks sat in the front of the bus, when Martin Luther King Jr. was still in his adolescence, and during a period when nonviolent resistance was considered destructive and unproductive, there was Pauli Murray, arguably one of the most influential yet little-known figures in recent American history. It is hard to pinpoint Pauli Murray's greatest accomplishment. We could say that it was her founding of the National Organization of Women, currently one of the leading advocates for gender and LGBTQ equality in the U.S. We might also mention how Murray influenced Eleanor Roosevelt to take a stronger stance on racial justice before the First Lady drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We can also single out how, in her later years, Murray became the first African-American woman ordained as an Episcopal priest. Even without any of these achievements, Murray would still have a place in history for an essay she wrote in law school, titled, "Should the Civil Rights Cases and Plessy v. Ferguson Be Overruled?" In the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, going all the way back to 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that states were allowed to enforce segregation so long as public accommodations were separate but equal. In 1944, when Murray was the only African American woman in her class at Howard University Law School, all her teachers viewed Plessy v. Ferguson as constitutionally settled. Even those who were sympathetic to the cause of racial justice believed that the best approach was to acquiesce to the decades-old Supreme Court's decision. Even the NAACP's original strategy was to accept the principle of separate but equal, while utilizing case-by-case lawsuits to demonstrate how accommodations for African Americans were not treated equally. Murray's groundbreaking 1944 essay, however, attacked the entire constitutionality of separate but equal by emphasizing the separation part. Her innovation was to use psychological research to prove that the separation of the races had a negative cognitive impact. Accommodations could not theoretically be quote-unquote equal if segregation itself made black children feel inferior to whites. Murray's thesis was considered radical by her classmates, and they mocked the very presumption that Plessy v. Ferguson could one day be overruled. But 10 years later, when NAACP counsel Thurgood Marshall argued against school segregation in the 1954 case of Brown v. Board of Education, he relied heavily on Murray's research and used her argument to convince the Supreme Court to strike down Plessy v. Ferguson once and for all. In his majority opinion, Chief Justice Earl Warren paraphrased Murray's argument when he wrote, "To separate them, black children, from others of similar age and qualifications solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that they may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone." Murray's impact on the Brown v. Board of Education decision would be enough to solidify her place in history. But her contribution to civil rights went far beyond the legal field. 2 decades before the civil rights movement reached its peak in the 1960s, nonviolent civil disobedience was perceived to be morally unacceptable. Even among those sympathetic to the cause of racial justice, disobeying laws or defying the police was considered ineffective. A poll conducted by the Pittsburgh Courier in 1943 found that 70.6% of African Americans opposed a nonviolent disobedience campaign as not likely to help Negroes. When labor organizer A. Philip Randolph announced in December 1942 that his March on Washington movement was considering the use of civil disobedience, the editorial of the Pittsburgh Courier, a black newspaper, wrote that Randolph was guilty of the most dangerous demagoguery on record. But having studied Gandhi, Pauli Murray was one of the few at the time who believed in the potential of nonviolent resistance. Long before it was considered a viable strategy for civil rights, she was a trailblazer of civil disobedience. In the spring of 1940, Murray was arrested for sitting in and refusing to move from the white-only section of an interstate bus. Although she lost the court battle, she would go on to co-found, along with James Farmer, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, the organization which led the influential freedom rides in 1961. In 1941 and 42, Murray worked with the Socialist Workers' Defense League and collaborated with A. Philip Randolph's March on Washington movement. During this time, she protested and fundraised to appeal the case of Odell Waller, a black Virginian sharecropper who shot his landlord in self-defense. With Virginia's Jim Crow laws only allowing registered voters who paid the poll tax to be selected to serve in court, Waller was denied a jury of his peers and was sentenced to the electric chair. Although a relatively small movement then, those protests in the 1940s helped Randolph lay the foundation for the historic March on Washington in 1963. As Murray herself recalled, a few activists in 1942 had pointed the way to the massive nonviolent protest demonstrations led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the 1950s and 1960s, and our solemn protests did not end on a totally somber note. And in 1943 in Washington, D.C., Murray and 19 students, 12 of whom were women, staged one of the very first sit-ins of the civil rights movement at an all-white lunch counter. Historians often pinpoint the start of the civil rights movement with Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycotts or the 1960 Greensboro 4 protest, which is often mistakenly thought as the first lunch counter sit-ins. But as civil rights activist Eleanor Holmes Norton recalled, nonviolent resistance to gain civil rights did not begin with the bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama in 1956. It began with bus incidents in 1940 and was perfected as a technique before 1945. Referring to early activists like Pauli Murray and A. Philip Randolph, she notes that they pointed the way towards a movement towards integration that would be for the first time reach the Negro masses and bring daring campaigns to the very heart of racism. Whether it was her court case for sitting on a white-only section of a bus, or protesting the unjust trial of Odell Waller who was eventually executed, Murray often lost the battle she fought. But the trail she blazed would lead her successors to ultimate victory. She would be vindicated decades later when nonviolent resistance did become a viable strategy for the civil rights cause. One thing we can learn from Murray's life is that those who struggle for a just cause may often fail at first, but their struggle builds the foundation upon which the next generation of activists can succeed. Not everyone may remember the name Pauli Murray, but we all continue to live in the shadow of her legacy.
Well, I would ask my mother, why don't you go with me? I will ask my mother, come on and go with me.
As a shy, former beauty contestant with aspirations to become a Catholic nun, Diane Nash comes off as the most unlikely person to develop into the most militant leader of the entire civil rights cause. In 1960, Nash got her start as a college student at Fisk University, where she served as the head of the Central Committee of the Nashville Student Movement. Following the sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina, Nash helped expand the protest by organizing hundreds of others to sit in at whites-only lunch counters in Nashville. It was one of the most successful civil rights protests at the time, as Nashville became one of the first southern cities to desegregate restaurants. The success can be attributed not only to the scale of the sit-ins, but also in the way the student-driven movement was able to prolong the protests by having activists refuse to pay bail to get out of jail. Nash felt that, by paying these fines, the protesters would be contributing to and supporting the injustice and immoral practices that have been performed in the arrest and conviction of the defendants. Needless to say, it was an extremely risky move for the students to refuse to pay bail, as a protracted term in jail could mean expulsion from their university. But Nash was a militant in her commitment to nonviolence and believed that to unleash the utmost pressure, one has to maximize the willingness to sacrifice. Following the success of Nashville, Diane Nash became an organizer with the newly formed Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and joined the Freedom Rides in 1961. In collaboration with the Congress of Racial Equality, led by James Farmer, the purpose of the Freedom Rides was to enlist young black and white activists to ride on interstate buses across state lines in the segregated South. By violating Jim Crow laws, they were not only being provocative, they were also taking great personal risk, knowing that they would be arrested and very likely met with violence by white mobs in the South. According to James Farmer, the national director of CORE, the purpose of the Freedom Rides was to intentionally attract danger in the hopes of creating a situation that was headline news all over the world and affected the nation's image abroad. An international crisis. That was our strategy. The Freedom Rides indeed got the attention Farmer wanted, and out of national embarrassment, the Interstate Commerce Commission was forced to desegregate interstate transportation in 1961. The Freedom Rides also had another impact. Led by young students like Diane Nash, John Lewis, and Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, the Freedom Rides encouraged high-profile civil rights leaders, including, eventually, Martin Luther King Jr., to make similar sacrifices. When Martin Luther King Jr. was initially asked to join the Freedom Rides, he refused. Of course, at this point in the movement, he had already suffered much. He had been hospitalized after a stabbing, and he once had a pipe bomb thrown into his house. But knowing that the Freedom Rides were initially conceived in order to incite white mob violence and lengthy jail sentences, King was hesitant to make any more sacrifices. According to his wife Coretta, jail going wasn't easy for him because he never liked to be alone. In response to King's refusal to join the Freedom Rides, Diane Nash wrote a lengthy memo to other activists, including King, in which she urged leaders to mean what we say on nonviolence and be prepared to go to jail and stay. Significantly, King read Nash's words and afterward vowed to do better. 2 years later, he would write his celebrated letter from Birmingham jail, in which he famously argued for the necessity of disobeying unjust laws, echoing the words and ideas of freedom riders like Diane Nash. The 1963 Birmingham campaign succeeded in paving the way for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned racial discrimination in public facilities. But even with this success, there still remained the issue of voting rights, which would require more struggle and sacrifice to attain. Among historians, there is little debate that the marches in Selma in 1965 were decisive in securing the eventual passage of the Voting Rights Act. But when it comes to assigning credit for these protests, we find some who seem to be rewriting the historical record. A former member of Lyndon B. Johnson's cabinet, Joseph Califano, for example, wrote in a 2014 Washington Post article that Selma was LBJ's idea. But according to Nash, Califano's assertion is patently false. As she explains in a written rebuttal, it was, in fact, the courage, work, thoughtfulness, sacrifice, discipline, and determination of citizens of the United States that obtained our right to vote. She concluded by saying, "The impression too often perpetuated in history books and in popular culture is that you have to be a president, someone special, or white to have an important idea or to achieve major accomplishments. This is an idea that disempowers citizens and should not be propagated further." Sure enough, the inception of the Selma marches goes back to a time before LBJ was even president. It started on September 15, 1963, when 4 young black girls were murdered in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing in Birmingham, Alabama. It was an injustice that particularly shocked Nash. In fact, her initial reaction was to ditch her commitment to nonviolence and personally hunt down the KKK members who orchestrated the bombing. But eventually, Nash channeled her righteous indignation into the effort to prevent further murders by securing the political rights of black Americans. Nash proposed forming a quote-unquote nonviolent army with the objective of removing Governor George Wallace from office, as well as registering to vote every citizen 21 years or older in the state. In addition to organizing a general strike and surrounding the state capitol building, Nash also planned to have volunteers lie down on railroad tracks to disrupt transportation. When Nash shared her proposal with Dr. King, he simply laughed and told her to think about this. But Diane Nash, with her then husband James Bevel, went ahead with their quote-unquote nonviolent army and launched the Alabama Voting Rights Project in 1963. And this would culminate with the historic Selma marches in 1965. The most pivotal moment of the Selma campaign occurred on March 7th, a day known as Bloody Sunday, when Alabama state troopers clashed with civil rights protesters at Edmund Pettus Bridge. Although Dr. King joined the later marches, the eventual Bloody Sunday was organized by the younger contingent of the civil rights movement, including John Lewis, who had his skull cracked, and Diane Nash, who served as a medic. A national outcry after Bloody Sunday forced LBJ to sign the Voting Rights Act in August of that same year, and Dr. King awarded Diane Nash and her then husband the SCLC Freedom Medal for conceiving the Alabama Voting Rights Campaign. Bestowing the award, King acknowledged that the new landmark law had risen from their anguished response to the Birmingham church bombing. One key to Diane Nash's success is the way she did not get stuck in hero worship, a trap that many contemporary activists so often fall into. "I never considered Dr. King my leader," Nash said in 2015, reflecting on the events of Selma. "I always considered myself at his side, and I considered him at my side." She viewed a giant like Martin Luther King as merely an ally walking beside her. And if he didn't walk beside her, she simply walked faster until he caught up.
My boss, why don't you let me go? I will ask my boss, why don't you let me go?
The example of Fannie Lou Hamer teaches us that you don't need a quote-unquote professional background to be a movement leader. While many of the key leaders within the civil rights movement had at least a college education, Fannie Lou had to drop out of school in the 6th grade to pick cotton. Born in the Mississippi Delta, she was the 20th of 20 kids born to Jim and Ella Townsend, and she spent most of her life as a sharecropper trying to make ends meet. Yet, despite her lack of formal education, Hamer proved herself to be an electrifying spokesperson for the movement. Later in her career, Hamer would share the stage with noted orators like MLK and Malcolm X. According to civil rights activist Eleanor Holmes Norton, it was not unusual for Hamer to even upstage her fellow speakers. By the time Hamer finishes a speech, Norton once observed, "You never needed to hear anybody else speak again." Another distinctive aspect of Hamer's life is the relatively late age at which she came to the movement. Unlike many of the key civil rights leaders who started organizing in their 20s and early 30s, Hamer first got involved in her mid-40s in 1962. When Hamer tried to register to vote for the first time in her life, she didn't pass the phony quote-unquote literacy test that kept the voter registration rate of Black Mississippians at 1%. And for the mere fact that she tried to exercise her constitutional right, Hamer was fired from her job as a sharecropper and evicted by her white landlord. Afterward, Hamer was recruited by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee as a field secretary. Her role was to expand SNCC's voter registration campaign in Sunflower County, the same county where, 7 years prior, 14-year-old Emmett Till had been murdered for supposedly looking at a white woman the wrong way. Organizing in Mississippi, the state that had by far the highest number of documented lynchings in the U.S., Hamer faced repeated death threats. She survived a drive-by shooting by the KKK, an arsonist burned down the SNCC headquarters, and on June 9, 1963, when Hamer and 8 other SNCC activists decided to test the 1961 Interstate Commerce Commission ban on segregated buses, she was arrested in Winona, Mississippi. In jail, she was raped, flogged with a blackjack until she lost consciousness, and was forced to sign a coerced confession. But despite her torture, Hamer never wavered from her calling. "If I fall, I'll fall 5 feet 4 inches forward in the fight for freedom." And quoting the Bible, she remarked, "A city that's set on a hill cannot be hid, and I don't mind my light shining. I don't hide that I'm fighting for freedom because Christ died to set us free." In 1964, 2 years into the voter registration campaign, Hamer ran in the Democratic primary for Congress. She knew, of course, that she had no chance of winning, and her campaign was mainly a vehicle to encourage Black Mississippians to register to vote. In the end, she received merely 385 votes against the 29,711 for the incumbent Jamie Whitten. But for Black Mississippians, voting in Democratic primaries was even harder than voting in the general elections. In addition to poll taxes, there was even a state law prohibiting people from participating in party primaries if they did not agree with the principles of that party. And the Mississippi Democratic Party itself had enshrined segregation in its party platform, stating that the separation of the races is necessary for peace and tranquility of all people of Mississippi. Despite all these daunting obstacles, SNCC and Hamer felt they had an opening. With President Johnson hoping to secure the nomination at the 1964 Democratic National Convention, the civil rights movement in Mississippi believed they could bring the issue of voting rights to a televised audience. They knew that barring people of color from the primary process, the official Mississippi Democratic Party was violating the rules of the National Democratic Party, whose platform affirmed that the right to vote is the first principle of government. Hoping to leverage this obvious discrepancy, SNCC activists founded an alternative Democratic Party which they named the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, MFDP, with Hamer as their vice chairwoman. By forming a state party that was open to all races and that actually followed the rules of the National Democratic Party, they were able to demand that the DNC disqualify the all-white Mississippi Democratic Party and seat the MFDP as official delegates in their place at the convention. Through their campaign, the MFDP would eventually collect 60,000 signatures in Mississippi, which they then brought to the DNC in Atlantic City to make their case. And on August 22, 1964, before the DNC officially opened, Fannie Lou Hamer gave a speech to the Credentials Committee that, according to the New York Times, left the audience spellbound. Hamer simply told her story, how she had lost her job, her home, and almost her life for trying to register to vote. When she also told the story of her arrest and torture in Winona, she brought many DNC officials listening to tears. With the Credentials Committee composed mostly of Northern Democrats, they had been completely unaware of the extent of the horror Black Mississippians had to face every single day. For them, Hamer's speech was a revelation. Hamer closed her speech by saying, "If the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephone off of the hooks because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America?" As Hamer walked off, she received a standing ovation. Unfortunately, one person not moved by her words was President Johnson, who called her a no-good woman who was raising hell. With fears that he would be facing a tough presidential election, LBJ felt that he could not annoy the all-white Mississippi Democratic Party, whom he was convinced he needed to win the South. LBJ also had a classist disdain for Hamer. He didn't like the way she dressed, spoke, and he said she was not the kind of person white America needs to see representing black people, and that an illiterate woman must never be allowed to speak again at a Democratic convention. Johnson was true to his word and tried to stop Hamer's voice from being heard. One of the several ways that the president tried to do this was to hold an impromptu press conference in the middle of her testimony before the Credentials Committee. While teasing the media that he would be sharing the news about his vice presidential nominee, Johnson's real purpose was to move the television cameras away from a black woman sharecropper as she spoke truth to power. Although the Credentials Committee was moved by Hamer and signaled their readiness to support the MFDP's demands, Johnson managed to strong-arm and threaten Democratic officials to protect the all-white Mississippi Democratic Party. And in the end, the demands of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party were rejected. But Johnson ended up the real loser. Despite his shameless effort to placate them, the all-white Mississippi Democratic Party were already furious at his signing of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and ended up walking off the convention floor anyway. In a final act of defiance and protest, Hamer and the MFDP decided to occupy their vacated seats. With the convention floor under televised news coverage, Johnson could do nothing. He knew how badly it would be perceived by the liberal press if the MFDP were to be thrown out. He had already lost the South thanks to the walkout of the all-white Mississippi Democratic Party. He could not afford to lose the North as well. The protest embarrassed and pressured Johnson. The following year, he was forced to sign the Voting Rights Act. The story of Fannie Lou Hamer is one of a working-class sharecropper with a mere 6th grade education, bringing the most powerful man in the world to his knees. Political movements are similar to electoral campaigns. In the same way that one needs a candidate and a campaign manager to have a successful run for office, Political movements also need a spokesperson to receive all the attention, as well as the strategists to work behind the scenes. In the civil rights movement, figures such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Fannie Lou Hamer ultimately fell into the former category. Like a political candidate, each flourished in the spotlight and used their distinct voice to carry the message and fire up supporters. But behind the curtain, the strategists are just as vital as the ones standing in the spotlight. Their impact on what occurs on stage is more subtle. In the civil rights movement, there were many who fit this description, but perhaps none more exemplary than Ella Baker, who founded the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1960, and Bob Moses, who launched the Mississippi Voting Rights Campaign in 1961. By the time the civil rights movement was reaching its peak in the 1960s, Ella Baker had already been hardened by 30 years of organizing experience. She has been described as an intimidating woman, about whom historian and activist Howard Zinn once remarked, "You never felt like you could go up and give her a hug." Meanwhile, Bob Moses, Baker's most loyal disciple, was a soft-spoken Harvard graduate from Harlem, whom Diane Nash and James Bovell both described as being too intellectual for Mississippi. Aware of these limitations, as well as their strengths, Baker and Moses understood their role in the civil rights movement was as strategists behind the scenes. When Baker founded the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, she was driven by the need to uplift the most marginalized into positions of leadership. She believed firmly in the right of the people who were under the heel to be the ones to decide what actions they were going to take to get out from under their oppression. But even within SNCC, the idea of delegating leadership and power to the marginalized was actually not a popular one. SNCC activist James Forman, for instance, advocated a strong centralized organization with a limited cadre of organizers who moved around instigating protests. But Baker insisted on placing an emphasis on working with indigenous people, not working for them, but trying to develop their capacity for leadership. Bob Moses shared this belief with Baker, and he articulated it clearly when he talked about the voter registration campaign in Mississippi in 1961. "The leadership is there," Moses insisted when he first arrived in Mississippi. "We don't know who they are now. We don't need to know. If you go out and work with people, then leadership will emerge." Confident in Baker's conviction that the leadership for the South had to be Southern leadership, Moses sought to find indigenous leaders in Mississippi. And sure enough, Bob Moses took notice of a courageous sharecropper named Fannie Lou Hamer and was the one who recruited her into SNCC in 1962. It must be noted, however, that this insistence on cultivating local leadership did not mean Moses was against outsiders getting involved. After all, Moses himself was a Northerner. On the contrary, outsiders needed to be involved, but their involvement demanded that they remain respectful and understanding of their proper role within the movement. For instance, when there was a debate within SNCC on whether or not to recruit whites from the North to be part of the voter registration campaign in Mississippi, Moses saw the advantage of their participation and argued that if you have white people working alongside of you, it changes the whole complexion of what you're doing. So it isn't any longer Negro fighting white, it's a question of rational people against irrational people. But at the same time, Moses recognized the hazards that came with too much outside collaboration, especially the kind that might come from educated Northern whites. Once they were recruited, Moses reminded them that they were not there to save the Mississippi Negro, and that they should not be commandeering the leadership space for themselves. And so, it was as behind-the-scenes strategists that both Baker and Moses viewed their roles, and in this capacity, they made remarkable achievements. One of Ella Baker's key contributions in SNCC was the inclusion of a voter registration campaign. This first caused some friction among the original organization members who wanted to focus on the use of civil disobedience with actions like the Freedom Rides. John Lewis, for instance, was suspicious of voter registration, viewing the push as a trick by the government to take the steam out of the movement to slow it down. But Baker believed that voter registration could go hand in hand with civil disobedience. While still acknowledging the necessity of dramatic direct actions, she was also a believer in the long and slow process of base building. With the Freedom Ride centered on a small cohort of dedicated activists, Baker knew that a voter registration campaign would offer the opportunity to recruit more members to be part of a massive, large-scale movement. To appease critics like John Lewis, Baker established two wings within SNCC to handle both civil disobedience and voter rights. She hired the fiery Diane Nash to lead the quote-unquote direct action wing of the organization, and she sent organizers like the mild-mannered Bob Moses to launch the voter registration campaign in Mississippi. Grateful for his dedication and sacrifice, Fannie Lou Hamer often liked to draw the rather obvious comparison between Bob Moses and his biblical namesake. But a tragic yet telling episode from the voter registration campaign shows how Hamer's comparison was more apt than even she may have realized. For just as the biblical Moses was plagued with guilt for having caused the death of another, Bob Moses had to cope with a similar remorse. One of his early recruits before Fannie Lou Hamer was a farmer named Herbert Lee, who was brutally gunned down in broad daylight by a Mississippi state legislator. It was a death that weighed heavily on Moses as he continued the work of recruiting other volunteers. Though it was one of the many instances of hate-driven violence that plagued the South, Moses had to deal with the painful knowledge that his recruitment of Herbert Lee is what led to his death. Out of respect for his fallen comrades, as well as his recruits that were making sacrifices, Moses was always mindful of leading by example, and to demonstrate that he, too, had the courage to die for the larger cause. In one instance during the spring of 1963, when black Mississippi demonstrators gathered in front of the Leflore County Courthouse, they were met by police in riot gear and German Shepherd dogs. While the other protesters heeded the police calls for them to retreat, Moses alone refused to move back. Despite his chronic fear of dogs, he continued to walk towards the courthouse, stopping only after one of the dogs had torn through his leg. Most school children today are taught about Martin Luther King Jr. or even John Lewis, but very few even remember the names Ella Baker and Bob Moses. Even during their day, these figures received little attention, but they understood what it meant to work behind the scenes and out of the spotlight. Ella Baker once remarked, "When the newspaper people come around, what do they look for? They don't look for a solid organizational drive, they look for a miracle performer." Now, it was true that Baker's talents were often ignored because of sexism, and Moses himself, as mentioned, was soft-spoken and not as charismatic as other leaders. But I would make the case that their lack of fame is attributed to their humility. They went out of their way to not be in the spotlight, choosing to let others shine instead. Before the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party's demands to be seated were ultimately rejected, Fannie Lou Hamer was approached by Hubert Humphrey, LBJ's eventual VP, with a compromise. Allow the all-white Mississippi Democratic Party to keep their delegate seats and accept, in exchange, 2 symbolic at-large delegate seats for the MFDP. Hamer's immediate reaction was to reject Humphrey's compromise, as it fell far short of their demands for at least 24 official delegate seats. But Martin Luther King advised the MFDP to accept the compromise. And NAACP executive Roy Wilkins lectured Hamer, saying she would be ignorant to reject it and that she didn't know anything about politics. As Hamer started to doubt her initial reaction, she went to Ella Baker and Bob Moses for guidance. "Do you think we ought to accept it?" she asked. Moses' answer was revealing as it was simple. "You grown, you make your own decision." Fannie Lou Hamer, in the end, was stuck by her decision to reject Humphrey's proposed compromise, and Moses stood by her, following her as she strode onto the convention floor for her protest. Ella Baker and Bob Moses may not get the credit they deserve, but they were the ideal leaders of the civil rights movement, as they led to let others lead. I began this episode by examining an early quote by Dr. King. Leadership never ascends from the pew to the pulpit, but invariably descends from the pulpit to the pew. As I conclude this episode, I would now like to say that I beg to differ. Although I have stated that the roots of nonviolent resistance within the civil rights movement can be traced to pioneers in the 1940s with figures like Pauli Murray, the movement only reached the mainstream with 3 triggering events starting in the 1950s. First, there was the Montgomery bus boycott. Although Rosa Parks is typically credited for starting the boycott with the refusal to give up her bus seat to a white passenger in December of 1955, we must also acknowledge the role of an earlier incident. On March 2, 1955, 9 months before Rosa Parks was arrested, 15-year-old Claudette Colvin from Montgomery also refused the bus driver's demands to give up her seat to a white passenger. Upon Colvin's arrest, civil rights activists including Rosa Parks believed her case would provide the much-needed cause célèbre to generate public sympathy for African Americans living in the Jim Crow South. But their initial excitement dimmed soon after because Colvin had darker skin, didn't have what they called good hair, and was both unmarried and pregnant, which was, of course, a taboo during the 1950s. The movement leaders eventually decided against using Colvin as the flashpoint for the bus boycott. Eventually, it would be Rosa Parks herself who would get arrested, and the name Claudette Colvin would virtually be forgotten largely due to reasons that we might now find superficial and irrelevant. Nevertheless, it is not an exaggeration to say there would not have been a Rosa Parks if it had not been for the courage of a spirited 15-year-old girl. The second major trigger for the civil rights cause was the death of Emmett Till, the 14-year-old boy who was brutally murdered in Mississippi for supposedly looking at a white woman. Although there had already been numerous lynchings and other murders of black people in Mississippi, none of these led to the national outcry that was generated by Emmett's mother, Mamie Till's decision to have an open casket at her son's funeral. She wanted the world and the press to see the battered body of her son. No one asked Mamie Till to be an activist, nor was she trained for any leadership position, but she clearly understood the impact it would have to show the world her son's dead body. She managed to be strategic in a moment when she was suffering the most unimaginable grief. Finally, the third trigger that brought the civil rights movement into the mainstream was provided by the lunch counter sit-ins in 1960, starting with the Greensboro 4 in North Carolina and spreading in places like Nashville, Tennessee. These spontaneous protests came without any formal guidance from the NAACP or King's SCLC. They took place before civil disobedience was considered a viable strategy, and it started with young students who felt compelled to break unjust laws, hoping that it would create a wave of righteous indignation that others would join. All 3 of these decisive triggers present examples of leadership emanating not from the top down, but from the bottom up. They were carried out by ordinary people, many of whose names are forgotten. As great as Dr. King was, many of his landmark accomplishments may also be seen as playing catch-up to the instinctive leadership displayed and courageously performed by people like Claudette Colvin, Mamie Till, and the Greensboro 4. But it is not just MLK who believed that leadership comes down from the pulpit. In fact, the idea that important decisions should come from the top has long been a problem within the political left. Marxists, for instance, believe that change occurs when a professional revolutionary vanguard comes into oppressed communities to raise quote-unquote class consciousness among those who suffer from quote-unquote false consciousness. Their heroes are V.I. Lenin and Leon Trotsky, men who are perceived to have understood the quote-unquote science of Marxism. But, looking past the civil rights movement, if we ask who the real changemakers have been throughout history, we find a different set of players performing the vital leading roles. In the Russian Revolution, the Tsar wasn't overthrown by Lenin, who was still living in exile. The Emperor of Russia was overthrown on International Women's Day, when women textile workers staged a general strike in St. Petersburg. The real vanguard of the revolution, we see, was made up of women workers whose names are not recorded. Or take the other great revolution in human history. The French Revolution was initially an effort to reform and to establish a constitutional monarchy. It wasn't until the Women's March on Versailles on October 5, 1789, that the revolution took a radical turn, leading to the eventual formation of the First French Republic. While historians remember the names of men like Lafayette or Robespierre, the names of ordinary, working-class women who carried out the most important actions of the French Revolution are largely unknown. The civil rights movement was not the hero's tale of Martin Luther King Jr. It was a long struggle carried out by sharecroppers, students, grieving mothers, and a 15-year-old girl. In the end, those who write history are in fact ordinary people. They are working-class men and women who refused to wait for heroes and assumed leadership for themselves. Historians may neglect to record their names, or, at best, co-sign them to footnotes. But this matters little since we still live under the history these unsung heroes have written. And it will be up to all of us, as ordinary people, to write the next chapter.